Welcome everyone to the ITSM podcast, where we discuss everything related to IT service management. I'm Jeff Rumburg, managing partner and founder of MetricNet, and your host for the ITSM podcast. Today's show is the inaugural edition of the podcast, and I'm very pleased and honored to welcome our first guest to the show, Roy Atkinson. Roy serves as CEO and principal advisor for Clifton Butterfield, LLC. He's a recognized thought leader in information technology, service management, employee experience, and the customer experience. He's a fellow of the Institute for Digital Transformation and a member of HDI's Strategic Advisory Board. His expertise has been featured internationally in print, on podcasts, webinars, and conferences. CIO Insight called Roy a model for the future digital leader. That's high praise. Roy is one of HDI's top 25 thought leaders for 2023. He holds a master's certificate in advanced management strategy from Tulane University's Freeman School of Business. Roy, welcome to the show.
It is a pleasure to be here, Jeff, and congratulations on the launch of your podcast.
Thank you so much. We were talking and kind of joking last week about the fact that we go to a lot of the same events. Most recently, the HDI service management world. We crossed paths, we said hello, but it seems that we're always so busy at these events, we never really get a chance to kind of sit down and talk to each other. So I'm looking forward to a great catch-up session today and kind of mining your insights about the industry.
Great. I'm happy to be here, Jeff. And you're one of the few people who I can pinpoint the exact time and date you, and that was in 2010 at a series of HDI forums in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Yeah, you sent me the picture a few days ago. And I remember that conference, that session. I believe I was chairing a session on desktop support at the time. I believe we may have met each other before that, or I had at least heard of you before that. I think that's the better way to put it. But yeah, that event, I think, was your first day at HDI, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct.
Roy, tell us a little bit about how you got started in this industry. I gave your brief bio up front, but that only scratches the surface. And I'm curious to hear from you directly a little bit more about your journey, how you got started in this industry and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. It's kind of interesting. I spent about 20 years of my life as a professional full-time musician. And back in the 1980s, a lot of technology started to explode in the music industry, specifically in the recording studio, when things like MIDI, the musical instrument digital interface, happened. Lots of digital devices and techniques were popping up in the recording studio. And I had been a geek as a kid, and I got progressively more and more interested in the technology, and I decided to make a leap from the music industry into technology, specifically in IT. And I stopped booking a year ahead in 1995 and set my sights on 1996 when I would have a job in IT. And in fact, specifically the end of July 1996, and I started my first job in IT on August 3rd, 1996. So I hit it pretty closely on target. And I went to work at a small think tank, international think tank, but relatively small. And I was basically the hub of their IT department and learned a tremendous amount on the fly. And it was very interesting to take them on their journey, and it was my journey as well. And then I found myself working with the Apple Consultants Network and spent several years doing that. And that got me to the Jackson Laboratory, which is a very large mammal genetics research organization with facilities in Maine, Connecticut, California, and in China. And worked at the Jackson Laboratory for just about 10 years before going to HDI. And that was a tremendous opportunity for me. And we did some really cool stuff with IT, as you can imagine, in a genetics research facility. So it's been an interesting journey. And it comes on the back. I said, as a professional full-time musician for 20 years, but of course, before I made the launch into music, I had lots of jobs and had background in banking, retail, and various aspects of customer service. So the two kind of merged when I got into service and support.
Fascinating journey, Roy. I had no idea about your pre-IT career, particularly the music portion of that career. It's quite fascinating. But surprisingly, there's a lot of individuals that work in information technology that came out of the music industry. And I'm convinced that there's some causation, some correlation there. I don't know what it is about music that launches people onto IT careers, or sometimes vice versa, or sometimes simultaneously. So you filled in a significant portion of your history for me, and thank you so much for that. Roy, the theme of our show today is the current state of IT support. So I want to start with a question about how the industry has evolved, and specifically, what do you see as the most striking differences between now and the time when you got started in the industry?
I think we don't have to go too far to discover that the amazing amount of technology that's applied to the industry now, which didn't exist much before 2000 and even later than that, the ability to monitor, the ability to make changes across networks, the ability to, let's start really simply. And I can remember going back to my first IT job, installing Windows 95 manually as a series of 27 floppy disks. And there was a batch of those disks on which disk 9 consistently failed. And you had to start from the beginning and try again. And the difference between that and now, when we're getting, gigabit speeds over the internet at home in our offices, it's just incredible to watch the megabytes fly by and do software updates and installations so much easier. So the manual processes have gone, and the ability to visualize and configure various devices and software over the network is tremendously different from what it was back then. Of course, that brings with it other complications.
Of course, that's just one example of how technology has revolutionized IT service and support. You're no longer having to do the manual installation of software. A lot of it is done automatically. It's done remotely. Doesn't always go smoothly, but huge differences there. I also see, of course, differences in the ITSM tools. Way back in the day, Ron Munn started a company called Ben Data, which later evolved into Heat and Front Range. That was, I believe, probably the first ticketing system in the ITSM industry. We've since had advances in remote proxying, whereby you can proxy into a user's device remotely and take over the device and do the troubleshooting that way. We've had advances in telephony and, of course, channels. There are a lot more channels now for service and support than there were when we both got started in this industry. So I would tend to agree with you, Roy, that technology has really been transformational in this industry, and is probably the single biggest change since you and I both got started in the industry. Interesting. Roy, what surprises you most about the industry today?
Well, I think that the surprise comes from the flip side of the topic we were just talking about, all the changes in the industry. And I think what surprises me a lot of times is to see how little has changed in some aspects of the industry. We're still talking about the same struggles. Mm-hmm. People still trying to figure out the way forward, still arguing or berating each other about which frameworks and processes they're using. What's the best practice? Is there such a thing as best practice? Is it good practice? There's still a lot of things holding organizations back. Mm-hmm. And that's what we try to help with as an organization. Clifton Butterfield is here to help advise businesses forward and help them select what's right for that organization, which is something that historically has been a roadblock. I think I wrote at some point on the HCI blog that the road to service management is littered with the carcasses of those who have mistaken a framework for ideology. People come to believe in some framework, or and that's not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is to figure out what your organization needs, and that's where your statistics and benchmarking are really instrumental, Jeff, to try to figure out how you fit and how the various frameworks and technologies will fit your organization.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Roy. And to add to that, the two opposite ends of the spectrum, some things never change, some things are constantly changing. I like to reference the fact that when I got started in the industry, the #1 category of ticket was password reset. And here, all these years later, the #1 category of ticket is still password reset. I find that quite fascinating. But at the same time, one of the really positive changes that I've seen in the industry since you and I have both worked in the industry is that historically it was viewed as kind of an ancillary support activity that wasn't considered core to the information technology value chain. But today, I believe that those who work in IT service and support are among the most talented in information technology, and it's now viewed as a strategic activity that actually creates and enhances value within the IT organization. It creates that value through shift left. It creates that value by deflecting contacts into lower cost channels. And ultimately, it creates value by returning productivity to end users. And that's the biggest component of ROI in service and support. So I, like you, see two ends of the spectrum, things that haven't changed very much in 30 years and things that have changed a whole lot. And one of the most I think transformational changes is this idea that IT service and support is now viewed as a strategic activity by most organizations. And if leveraged properly, it can really return a lot of productive hours to the end users that are being supported.
And I will add to that, that those of us who have worked the long hours of service and support within IT have been saying that for a long time, that we really are, because that service and support function has its finger on the pulse of the organization. We can help information technology, whether it's a department or a capability, however you want to look at it, we can help direct IT so that it becomes more responsive and more progressive in terms of moving the entire business forward, because we know what's missing, we know what's wrong, we know what users are saying. And that's a really important component. That brings us to, of course, to the whole experience question. I know we're going to talk a little bit about that. You can't talk to me without talking about experience, Jeff.
Right. And just to add to that, not only does service and support have their finger on the pulse of IT, they are the interface between the users and information technology. And that puts them in a very strategic position, because what we've seen, Roy, is that customer satisfaction with all of information technology is a direct result of their satisfaction with service and support. Now, that might sound counterintuitive, but the reality is, as we all know, most users don't interact with those in IT that are, say, in applications or running a NOC or managing the network, but they do have frequent interactions with service and support through multiple channels. It might be a chat, it might be a voice interaction, it could be a web submitted ticket or an email submitted ticket. But the reality is 90+% of any interaction and contact that users have with information technology is through service and support. So if they have a good experience there, they're likely to think positive things about all of IT. By contrast, if they don't have a good experience with IT service and support, they're likely to conclude negative things about all of information technology. So I would argue that not only do they have their finger on the pulse of IT and the customers, but they shape the experience of the customer perception of all of information technology. And that puts them at a strategic gateway, essentially the gateway between the users and information technology.
Absolutely true. And that is why we have been saying for a long time that service and support is the face of IT. That's what's meant by that phrase, is we're the folks who are poking into people's offices and asking how things are going, and telling IT how things are going. So that intermediary function is extremely important.
Exactly. And I'll add a little statistic here, which will demonstrate how high leverage service and support is. Out of total IT spending, about 4% is devoted to service and support, and that would include level 1 service desk. It would include desktop support and field services, as well as vendor support. 4% of total IT spending, yet it has a disproportionate influence on customer satisfaction with all of IT, and it has the potential to create economic value through the mechanisms I mentioned earlier, which would be shift left, deflecting contacts into lower cost channels, and ultimately returning productive hours to the end users. So it's really a high leverage activity. It's a strategic activity, and I'm very pleased that the industry is coming around to recognizing these things, because it's good for those who work in the industry, and it's good for information technology organizations worldwide to acknowledge and leverage the fact that IT service and support is very strategic. Roy, over the past several years, the customer experience, and this is where we get into one of your many areas of expertise, the customer experience and XLAs have been a dominant topic. Has this helped the industry? Do you believe that the industry is better off today because of this?
I absolutely believe it. The industry is better off, and I think organizations are better off. Once you start to think about experience versus transactional measurement, life changes, right? If you look at, let's say, the customer satisfaction survey that gets sent out after a particular ticket, that tells you about that particular time and that particular occasion when an end user, or if you choose to call them a customer, at least a consumer of technology services, has a good or bad time with service and support. That's great, and it's really good to know and very important for support organizations to know that. But it doesn't tell us about the rest of the experience. And I think it's been an interesting thing. It always bothered me to a certain extent that the service desk was what was getting measured on customer satisfaction, but the rest of IT was getting away with it, right? We weren't measuring that overall IT experience. And I think that that's one of the things that's come to the forefront. How do you people feel about your collaboration with IT? How do you feel about the way that your projects are being delivered? What's your overall impression of IT in the organization? Those kinds of questions are important because they can specifically point out areas for improvement. And, just what's bugging you, what's working, what isn't working, asking those simple questions overall, not just about a particular transaction. Very important, and will move information technology forward if the folks in IT are paying attention to it. So things like XLAs and experience management are very helpful to IT and as part of the larger organization. The IT experience management component to overall employee experience can be extraordinarily helpful.
I would agree with that assessment, Roy. And I would say very early on in the evolution of this industry, the experience didn't really matter that much. Nobody really thought much about it. In fact, there were a lot of memes about this. If you're a Saturday Night Live aficionado, the way I was many years ago, they had a series of skits about these two IT guys that would go out and provide support within their enterprise. And they would show up. It wasn't remote support. They would literally show up with a calculator on one side of their belt and 2 pagers on the other side of their belt. And they would act disgusted that the user even had a problem. And they would spout out some techno gibberish, if you will. And the user would say, well, what does that mean? How do I get my computer working again? They would roll their eyes. They'd push the customer aside. They'd sit down and they'd key in a whole bunch of keystrokes. And then they push the computer away and say, there, your computer's fixed. And that wasn't too far off from the reality of the situation, is that the early technology support individuals, there were exceptions, of course, but those that were early in the industry were very long on technical skills, a little bit short on customer service skills. But over time, I think the customer experience has caught up as being equal with the technology that you bring to the table when you're supporting a customer. And it's been really good for the industry because customers not only want a technology solution, they want it to be done with a positive experience. So I would agree with your assessment of that. And that's one of the ways the industry has evolved in a really positive way over the last several decades. So I appreciate that insight.
I agree with that. And it was something that my teams always aimed at because of my previous background with customer service work, it was something I was always focused on. So it wasn't just the survey numbers that we cared about. It was making sure that the users were really getting what they needed. And it was a pleasure to see how many of those end users came to us and said, I know you guys can help me, or thank you for teaching me about this, or helping me with that. It was just extraordinary when that happened. And it happened quite a bit. I had a great team.
That's fantastic. You know, today you can't really have a discussion about IT support without the subject of AI and machine learning coming up. Comes up in almost every conversation. I think it's fair to say that it's a fairly dominant topic today. What are your thoughts on AI and machine learning in IT service and support?
I think they can be phenomenal tools. I think we have to be very careful about how we apply those tools. But some of the things that are going on are absolutely amazing. And a lot of that technology is evolving, and we're going to see it in IT service and support very quickly, I think. But a lot of it's happening on one of the other areas that we cover, and that's the contact center. There's some tremendous technology going on in the contact center right now. One of the companies that I work with recently introduced an AI-powered tool specifically aimed at doing quality assurance, where they can now, instead of relying on recordings and people's review of those recordings, which they can only do a tiny percentage of all of the recorded calls, of course, they can have AI basically listen to a conversation in real time. And I've seen this done. It's an absolutely wonderful thing. A 10-minute conversation between an agent and a customer happens. And then they say, okay, now summarize this according to these quality metrics. And they get 3 seconds later, they have a summary with all their 5 QA measurements covered. It's an astounding thing to see that happen, and it can add so much. AI agent assist, that's happening in service and support now, where you have somebody at the service desk maybe doesn't know quite enough about this, and they can get a whisper, or they can get an on-screen text that says, hey, here's the knowledge that you need, or here's a place for you to look for that knowledge. And that's just terrific. Being able to plow through mountains of dark data, basically. I mean, this stuff is laying around in companies and nobody can use it because there's just so much of it. It's not humanly possible to get through it. But AI can analyze so much of this. So we've been talking about predictive analytics and post analytics for a long time. We're at the period now where we can get readings on how things are going in real time, and it's phenomenal to see.
Right. Great insights. And just to add to the comments you made about the call quality monitoring, as you pointed out, it was a very manual, tedious process in the past where oftentimes the stereotypical supervisor or team leader would do 4 call recordings, would record 4 calls a month. It was called silent monitoring. They would sit down with each agent every month and go over those 4 calls and grade those 4 calls. It was extremely time consuming. It was only a small sample, as you pointed out, typically 4 calls out of maybe 1,000 or 2,000 calls per month. So it didn't really give deep insight into the quality of service that agent was delivering. Moreover, one of the things that we discovered early on is that if you looked at the relationship between customer satisfaction and call quality, it didn't always track. And my thought was always, hey, if the call quality is good, the customer ought to have a good experience, and there should be a high level of customer satisfaction with that. And it struck me that maybe what was being measured in call quality were not the right things, or were not the things that were important to the customers. And the technology that you were talking about, I've seen demos of that as well, where they measure every call in real time. They can detect voice inflection. They can detect anger. They can listen for keywords. They can listen for empathy. It's incredible. It is truly amazing technology. And it can it's not just sampling, it's looking at the quality of every single call and providing, in many cases, real-time feedback for supervisors or even individual contact center agents so that they can learn on the fly and recognize that, okay, on that last call, I gave a great solution. but I wasn't asking enough questions, or I wasn't demonstrating enough empathy, or there wasn't enough inflection in my voice, or the tone of my voice might have been too harsh. It's amazing how much it picks up, not just on the quality of the solution, but on the nature of the interaction, the customer experience, if you will. And that's just one of many examples of the technologies that we're starting to see in this industry, both in IT service and support, as well as the contact center. So great insight on that. I, like you, believe that this technology will be transformational to service and support. In fact, I did a presentation on this at the HDI Service Management World Conference in Las Vegas about a month ago. And it's going to change the industry dramatically. However, right now, I believe that the gap between the hype of AI and sort of the reality of AI is kind of maximum. You hear so much about it, particularly now that ChatGPT is, I don't know if I would say mainstream, but everybody talks about ChatGPT, and everybody from Elon Musk to frontline starting analysts in IT service and support are talking about AI and what impact it's going to have on all industries, not just the industry of IT service and support. Yet I haven't seen in IT service and support a huge amount of AI manifest itself yet. Not that it's not going to come. I believe absolutely that it's going to have an incredible impact on the industry overall. But right now, the gap between the reality of AI in service and support and the hype around AI in service and support, I think, is at its maximum level. And that happens with every new technology. You know, the hype curve sort of leads, and eventually reality does catch up. But it's fascinating the way it will transform this industry. When I spoke about this at the HDI conference, I mentioned that those that are dedicated to this industry can remain relevant by becoming IT support engineers, much like in the auto industry of the 1960s, 70s, very labor focused, a lot of manual labor in the assembly of automobiles. And now the automobile assembly line almost has no labor involved. It's robotic welding, it's robotic painting, it's robotic assembly. And the engineers who work on the auto assembly line are behind safety glass, and they're looking at computer screens, and they're looking at tolerances on alignment of body panels and the reflectivity of the paint and the strength of the welds. And much in the same way, I believe that service and support agents or analysts or technicians, whatever you want to call them, are going to evolve into support engineers who will direct the AI and will manage the AI tools to do most of the work preemptively, strategically, automatically. The idea that the best ticket is the ticket that never happens is one of the big promises of AI, whereby through detecting anomalies, preemptively identifying aberrant behavior in the IT environment, a lot of tickets can be avoided either by self-correcting, that is the technology self-correcting, or by sending an alert to IT so that they can make that correction. But I see huge changes coming in this industry. And although there's a lot of fear about job loss in the industry, I believe that there's never been a better time to work in IT service and support. And those that are truly committed to this industry will find a way to survive and stay ahead of the technology, and eventually will evolve away from being analysts, agents, and technicians to becoming IT support engineers. Oh, and
I agree with you.
One more thing about
Go ahead.
IT support engineers. They're starting to show up now in some of the more advanced service desks worldwide. Interesting fact, in North America, the average level 1 service desk analyst or agent technician starts at around $40,000 per year. And if you're doing that work in field services or desktop support, you start at around $45,000 a year. The support engineers that we see in North America are starting at around $120,000 a year. And these support engineers tend to spend their time more proactively as opposed to reactively. Of course, you can never get away from some reactivity in this industry, but to the extent that you can spend time on proactive things like process improvement, root cause analysis, problem management, incident management, and so on, you can actually preempt a lot of the incidents and service requests that drive volume in IT service and support. And we're starting to see that, and it's reflected in the salaries. Now, this isn't meant to tell everybody to go out and look for a job as an IT support engineer, but we see glimmers of what's going to happen in this industry. largely, or not largely, but at least partly as a result of AI maturing in service and support.
I agree there, Jeff. I think that there's a great book that I leaned a lot on when I did a series of conversations all around the country over a period of about 4 years, talking about the future of AI in IT. It was called Shifting Skills. Okay, and it was based on exactly that. Your skills have to change to go along with the technology. One of the books that I really leaned on hard is called Human Plus Machine. And that's where the strength lies. And in that interface between people and AI. AI can be what Paul Wilkinson brilliantly calls the shiny new thing that really matters, which is, of course, the illusion that a lot of organizations chase. But it can also be a growth tool. 10 minutes from where I'm sitting right now is an enormous facility for BMW automobiles. And over the past 10 years, they've invested a tremendous amount of money in automation and AI and robotics. And what they've discovered is that they need people. And they've almost doubled their staff at this facility as they've gone into automation and robotics and AI and computer controls, because there are some things that people do better, and there are some things that people plus machines can do incredibly well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a synergy that happens there when you've got the machine and the rapid computation, as well as the individual with the expertise. And it's a combination. I think the reason AI is finally coming into its own is, number one, big data. And we heard a lot about that in recent years, the idea that we now know how to process enormous amounts of data, not just terabytes, but petabytes, huge amounts of information, because computing power is so cheap. Also, we've seen that social acceptance of AI is coming faster than we had expected. 5 years ago, there was a lot of fear around AI, and there still is. But increasingly, what we find is social acceptance of AI. We did some research at MetricNet a year or so ago, where we asked a series of questions around AI, and overwhelmingly, more than 70% of the respondents had a favorable view of AI and the idea that it would help them leverage their skills and their expertise in IT service and support. So no longer does the industry fear it the way they once did, but you combine that, the social acceptance, if you will, of AI with the massive computing power and big data, and we kind of have a perfect storm in a positive sense, where we can start using these tools now to automate what was historically viewed as a high-skilled human job. And if you think about the complexity of incidents or tickets in general, on one extreme, very simple things like Windows or Microsoft Office support or password resets. And at the opposite extreme, you have industry-specific knowledge about particular applications and how-to about those applications. And you've got endpoint bots that are monitoring all of the endpoints in the environment and looking for anomalies and taking machines offline if it looks like they're about to fail. You have AI consuming the commodity side of that spectrum. And this, in turn, what we've observed, Roy, is driving kind of a bifurcation in sourcing, whereby many enterprises are sourcing their commodity end support. That would be the aforementioned password reset, the Microsoft Office, Windows, Outlook type stuff. They're sourcing that from offshore, very low cost, low value add type stuff. But a lot of the more complex support is being reshored. This massive reshoring actually began about 2017, where we saw more reshoring than offshoring going on. And moreover, the technicians are being co-located with the business, because what we've learned over many years is that knowing the business helps. So being a technology support person is good, but if you also know your vertical market, whether that's insurance or business services or hospitality or financial services, knowing the industry helps a lot as well, as being a good technology support person. So we're finding that a lot of the reshoring is happening on the more complex end of the spectrum, and those technicians are being co-located with the business. And despite the fact that there's oftentimes a big labor cost difference between the offshore commodity support and the onshore complex support, the total cost of ownership actually does go down because that onshore support, the more qualified, not to disparage those who are offshore, but those who are more expertise and understand the vertical market and understand the applications and infrastructure of the vertical markets that they are working in, they are able oftentimes through problem management to eliminate tickets at their source entirely, reduce ticket volume over time, thereby reducing the productivity impact of service and support, and reducing the total cost of ownership. So there's a fascinating dynamic going on simultaneous with AI. And in fact, the two are kind of feeding off each other. AI drove this bifurcation of commodity support offshore and the more complex support onshore. And the two trends tend to reinforce each other.
Yeah, it's all kind of fascinating to watch. And I think that one of the things that AI can help us with, because of its ability to get through these mountains of data that we all have, can give us very unexpected insights. I was on a call a couple of months ago with a CEO of a big company, and he asked a very simple question, and referring to his contact center again, he said, well, you know, we've got all these recorded conversations that we have. What if our sales team could find out how many times our customers mention our competition and whether that's in a positive or negative way? Right? I mean, what a brilliant business insight that would give to the sales team. It would be very interesting to help them address objections, to help them learn and feed information back to the developers to say, hey, we need to improve this. So there's a tremendous amount to be gained. And I think that as long as we're paying attention, and not to say that there are not huge problems associated with AI, where we have to talk about ethics, we have to talk about bias, we have to talk about all of the things that are potentially harmful, the same as we did with previous technologies, right? We're still assessing the downsides of screen time and computer usage over a long haul. We're still figuring that out. So we have to pay attention to that, but at the same time, the positive aspects are really amazing.
Yeah, that's a great use case. The idea that you can mine conversations and possibly even tickets to find references to your competition, and how was the competition compared to your own products and services? Was it in a favorable light? Was it in a negative light? Were they driven to you because they didn't like the competition? It's an incredible use case. Another really interesting.
And feeding off that, if I may, when I was running a support team, I often would sit down and do a lot of analysis on, okay, well, is it worth it for us to buy a 3-year warranty on these products that are coming in or not? What's the failure rate? When are they failing? How much is the cost of repair versus the cost of the warranty? There was a surprising data in there. And I think that the ability to get that rapidly and almost instantaneously now is phenomenal. I would love to be able to work with tools like that.
Yeah, let me give you another use case, Roy, that I found fascinating. I saw this demonstration recently. We all know that ticket categorization is imperfect at best. This is putting a ticket into a category so that you can look at potentially do some problem management with it, do some incident management with it, and use it for knowledge management so that you can do future troubleshooting. But we all know that usually one of the top 2 or 3 categories is other, meaning that a lot of tickets get thrown into this bucket called other because the analysts or the technicians either don't have the time to figure out exactly what categories and subcategories the ticket should belong to, or they just don't want to take the time to do it, or the workload is too heavy. AI tools have been able to look at both formatted data fields in a ticket as well as unformatted data. So the unformatted data being the notes that the technician might type in about resolving a particular ticket for a customer. And if you look at the way an enterprise might categorize its tickets, and then you apply AI to that, and you ask AI to find the common patterns and to create a new distribution of tickets, how do those tickets get categorized? It's entirely different. I won't go so far as to say that they're uniquely orthogonal, meaning they have nothing to do with each other, but the correlation is stunningly low, meaning that the original categorization of tickets looked nothing like the categorization after AI and big data looked at the formatted and unformatted data and decided that, no, that wasn't a password reset. That was a VPN token lock, or no, that wasn't an Outlook issue. That was some other issue. And it's really quite fascinating. And the value of that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is that you can do more effective problem management with better ticket categorization. You can do better knowledge management with more effective ticket categorization. So the use cases are plentiful. You mentioned some fascinating use cases from the contact center industry, as well as more broadly, just learning about the competition using AI. But it's going to manifest itself in many ways that we can't even imagine right now. And I think it's an exciting time to be in the industry. And speaking of AI, I think this is a great segue into kind of a broader question. And AI may play into this answer, but where do you see the industry going from here? What are your bold predictions for the industry?
I think that there's been a movement over the last few years, probably 5 years or more, as a convergence of business and IT. And that's why I said before, I'm qualifying things now. When I say IT, I might not be talking about a department. I'm talking about a capability in your organization. In a lot of places, it's still a department, but a lot of places it's not, where IT is just embedded throughout the organization. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing happen now, that's kind of a portent of the future. I think that there's a lot of digital expertise in the organizations now that didn't exist previously. The computers were kind of a separate world. Now I think that people are so used to using information technology throughout their daily lives. You know, we all walk around with the smartphone. We get our messages. We do our web surfing. We do our research. You know, I see myself standing in front of a shelf at a store, looking up competitive prices on my phone while I'm debating about whether or not I'm going to buy a specific product. We all do that. And I think that has transformed the way we approach our work. And we've seen it since the pandemic. It was, you know, remote work was maybe, okay, now, boom. And everybody went home. And guess what? Business, of course, in-person businesses like restaurants and stores and so forth were affected heavily, but the information continued to flow. Websites functioned. People were able to support other people remotely. Customer service agents were working from home. IT service desks were working from home. Everything continued to roll because of our abilities with technology to make it work. And I think that that capability that we have now to utilize technology in new and different ways is going to pull the industry forward. I think that IT is ready for some revolutionary happenings. AI, we've been discussing. We haven't talked about quantum computing, but that's coming as well. And the marriage of those two things is going to really create an amazing amount of change. But I think we're ready to move forward in more technological ways than we think we are.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment, Roy. And you've probably heard the term the S curve when you talk about new technology adoption. The adoption is slow at first, and then it ramps up dramatically, exponentially, and then it kind of levels out when it's mature. And we've got several S curves, I think, coinciding, creating a perfect storm. Hopefully in a positive sense, but you've got the AI S curve just starting to get on the steep part of the S curve. You've got the S curve around other technologies coincident with artificial intelligence and machine learning. You've got blockchain, you've got robotics, and these technologies are convergent simultaneously. And I think we're entering a phase, and you alluded to this, where technology has always driven change in society. And I think it's accelerating now because of these major trends with blockchain and with artificial intelligence, remote technologies, big data, massive computing power. You mentioned quantum computing and the cost of quantum computing coming down. When you put these S-curves together, you get what I would call an S-curve on steroids, meaning that the change is increasing rapidly and exponentially. And I don't think this or any other industry is going to look anything like it does today, 5 years or certainly 10 years from now. So I, like you, see a lot of change coming, and there's, both risk as well as opportunity. And hopefully the opportunity over time will win out, and whatever risks get addressed along the way will be mitigated. The ethical risks, the practical risks around job losses and things like that. Hopefully we'll get that figured out along the way. Humans are very innovative, and interestingly enough, despite all the technology we have today, there are more jobs in the world today than there have ever been before. And I believe that as the AI revolution continues, that will not change. You mentioned the book a little bit earlier, and the fact that humans are incredibly adaptable, and they can adapt and evolve and stay ahead of these technology revolutions. We've been doing it for 10,000 years. We were all running around collecting mushrooms and acorns as hunter-gatherers, and then we figured out basic agriculture and started planting crops, and small communities built up around these farming areas. And eventually we learned how to harness the power of animals to do farming, oxen that would plow the fields. And eventually the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s figured out how to mechanize farming. And we went from the arable land under agriculture in 1600 to 1800, over 200 years. The amount of land that was being farmed increased 100-fold, and the number of individuals who were involved in farming decreased by 99%. So we had a 100-fold increase in the amount of farming being done, and a 99% decrease, the same decrease in the opposite direction of those that were involved in farming because of the technology that was introduced. That displaced a lot of farmers, but they found other jobs. Likewise, the information technology age, which really kind of began in the 1950s, and then we had the internet again in the 1990s. Now we have Web3, starting in more recent years. These are disrupting industries all over the world. And I think there's a lot of focus on job loss, and there's a lot of fear about job loss. But historically, what has happened is that quality of life improves, and actually more jobs are created by these new technologies. I can't tell you right now what those are going to be as AI matures, as blockchain matures, and as some of these other technologies mature and begin to displace other types of jobs. But I believe that humans will innovate. And just like today, there are more jobs than there have ever been in the history of the world. 10 years from now, AI will be a lot more mature than it is right now. But I believe that there will probably still be more jobs available for those that are willing to invest in themselves, stay ahead of the curve, and educate themselves, and recognize that your learning doesn't finish at high school or at college or with your PhD. Learning is something that is lifelong, and it's a life skill.
And you mentioned the word innovation a couple of times there, Jeff, and I think it's key. If we look back through some of the tremendous changes that you talked about, the Industrial Revolution and so forth. Funny thing about innovation is that innovation plays off other advances. It always goes hand in hand with what's available. There would not have been the tremendous advances in exploration that we had unless somebody came up with the chronometer. Right? The ability to see the world and change the world plays off to various advances that we have. Electricity works because there was the AC, there was the DC, there was competitive advantages being sought, and somebody figured that out. We tried things, they didn't go well, or they did go well. Flight, same thing. I mean, my dad was born, it's amazing but true, I was always a late baby. My dad was born 2 years before the Wright brothers flew, and I sat with him and watched them land on the moon. And that's one lifetime of change right there. And it's absolutely astounding how things play off each other and seem almost to concur. They just pop up, they coincide. And so I think we're going to see a lot of that, as I mentioned, AI and quantum computing and lots of other changes that we're going to see in small ways in our own businesses, but across the world, it's going to be massive change.
Fascinating, Roy. Real interesting tidbit about you. Your father was there when the Wright brothers first flew, and you watched with your father the moon landing, which I think was in July of 1968, or some
1969. Yeah,
1969. Yeah, Apollo 11, I think it was. Wasn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah, Apollo 11. Quite fascinating. Yeah, so there is a real synergy. We wouldn't have computers without silicon chips. We wouldn't have silicon chips without the transistor. We wouldn't have the transistor without Bell Labs. So you can trace these technologies back and look at how they have built on each other over time. And I absolutely agree with you. The way they interact with each other, interplay with each other, it creates massive synergy that accelerates these S curves that I mentioned earlier. Roy, we're nearing the end of our time, but I have a couple final questions for you. And the first one is the following. If you could share one tip with IT management about service and support, what would it be?
I think the major one would be pay attention. And I think that what they have to pay attention to is what we were talking about before. Pay attention to the insights that can be gained, the business intelligence that's available to you from service and support. Again, being that interface between the end users, the people who are out there doing the work and trying to accomplish the business tasks every day, and IT. The amount of intelligence that's out there is astounding. People use things in ways that we can't always predict. And sometimes we have a tremendous amount to learn about the way people are using the applications and the technologies that we're providing. Pay attention to that, and there's a tremendous amount to be learned. So that would be one thing. The other thing is stop looking at it as a cost center and start looking at the potential, as you mentioned at the top of the discussion. Start looking at it as a potential value center. And I think there's just a tremendous amount to be gained. The amount of information that could be fed into sales, into marketing, into warehousing, it's everywhere in the organization. Every aspect of businesses now is interwoven with technologies, and the more insights you can get into that, the better off you're going to be.
I love that, Roy. Pay attention. It's so obvious, but so profound. And to your point about the value center versus the cost center, this gets to a point I made earlier about the evolution of the industry and how it's viewed more strategically now than it ever has been before. And that is precisely because a lot of organizations are shedding this idea that service and support is just a cost of doing business and doesn't create any economic value for the organization. But we've been able to actually compute the ROI of service and support. The return on investment, return is the numerator, investment is the denominator. And if you think about the annual operating cost of service and support, that's pretty straightforward. The return historically was harder to calculate. However, we've been able to look at the monetary value of the economic value created by service and support. And it comes, as I mentioned earlier, from shift left, that is pushing tickets to a lower cost support level and eventually eliminating them through problem management and artificial intelligence preemptively. Channel mix, that is, you deflect away from voice, which is a very expensive channel, and you deflect into voice bots or chat bots, which are lower cost, or you deflect into an email or a web submitted ticket, which are also lower cost. And then the ultimate prize is that you make users more productive. So for example, we have a client in Texas, large insurance company, that reduced their ticket volume on a per capita basis by roughly 50% through problem management and some artificial intelligence. And the way they through problem management and AI, reducing that ticket volume, reduced their total cost of ownership by more than 50%, because they not only reduced ticket volume, but they shifted left at the same time. And those are the kinds of things that create value centers. And if you can quantify that and monetize that, you start to recognize that the value of service and support is that you can return 10, 20, 30, or even 40 productive hours per user per year. We've been able to demonstrate this. The more effective you are at service and support, the more productive hours you return to your customers, either through quick resolutions, that is quick mean times to resolve, or the elimination of tickets altogether. But I love what you said about pay attention. It's, like I said, very obvious, but very profound. My final question for you, Roy, is this. What advice would you have for someone just getting started, say as a frontline support analyst or technician?
Again, it's a lot about paying attention. It's a lot about continuous learning, which you've already also talked about, Jeff. Stay with it. Learn as much as you possibly can. Be prepared for change. Be patient, because sometimes that change doesn't happen as rapidly as we would like. But there are enormous opportunities if you're pointing in the right direction, listening to what's going on around you, and watching the industry. And there are great sources. And Jeff, you know how much I draw from MetricNet all the time. I'm sure that you see me posting your stats, you know, a lot of the times with things that I talk about and webinars that I talk about. And you're a wonderful source of information. Pay attention to that and join organizations if that's your thing. To learn about the industry as a whole. Look for some good advice in terms of the direction of things. Don't bet the farm on it, but be prepared to move in good directions when the opportunity arises. So learn, and learn.
Great advice, great insight, Roy. We're out of time, but I just want to say thank you for joining me and being the first guest on the ITSM podcast. I think I've learned at least as much about you as I have about the industry today. Fascinating stories, fascinating dive into the world of IT service management. It's been a lot of fun, and I'd love to have you back again.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled and honored to be your first guest on the podcast, and all my good wishes for its success.